The stars flickered in the vast emptiness of space like tiny candles, held in the hand of some unseen god. Humanity had only recently learned how to reach for them. When the first ships sailed beyond Earth's atmosphere, their creators stood in awe of the black expanse of the universe. But soon realized it was not the universe that was awe-inspiring, but the humans themselves, for while the stars were ancient and cold, humanity was young and burning with a fire no alien species had ever seen before on a distant planet. A species known as the Lurkin had watched Earth's ascent with curiosity, then fear, for they had never encountered a race that not only survived adversity, but thrived in it. The Lurkin were a race of conquerors who prided themselves on their ability to take what they wanted and eliminate any threat to their empire. But when the first encounter between Lurkin and human occurred, it was nothing like they expected. Humanity did not bow to them or tremble with fear. No, humanity stood its ground. The Lurkin fleet arrived in orbit above Earth and sent a single message to humanity, a challenge. It was simple and direct: surrender or perish. There was no attempt at diplomacy, no offer of peace, simply the assertion that the Lurkin were the dominant force in the galaxy, and that humanity was not worthy of existence. The response from Earth was not what they anticipated. Instead of capitulation, humanity gave them a single reply: "We are coming for you." The Lurkin scoffed, dismissing the message as foolish defiance. But they underestimated humanity's capacity for ingenuity and resolve. The first human fleets began their journey across the stars, not with grand armadas, but with ships that were designed for one thing: survival. The human fleet was smaller than the Lurkin's, but it was faster, more agile, and far more unpredictable. The Lurkin had their warships sleek and efficient, designed for overwhelming firepower. But the humans had something different. They had creativity, they had adaptability, and most importantly, they had the ability to fight as one in ways no other species could. The battle began with an ambush. The Lurkin cruisers entered the human fleet's designated battle zone thinking it would be a massacre. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by human ships, appearing from every direction at once. While the Lurkin relied on raw power and coordination, the humans used misdirection and cunning to create chaos. The Lurkin were taken off guard as human ships slipped past their defensive lines, darting in and out with precision. The first strike was a devastating blow. The Lurkin flagship was crippled by a single shot from a human destroyer, its shields failing under the weight of the unexpected attack. Confusion spread through the Lurkin fleet as their formation began to disintegrate. A battle they had assumed would be quick and easy became a struggle for survival. The human ships moved like predators in a wild pack, slipping in and out of the shadows of space, striking at weak points before retreating like a storm of lightning in a dark sky, each attack more ferocious than the last. The Lurkin's arrogance began to fracture. As their once mighty fleet was scattered across the void, they had underestimated humanity's spirit, and now they would pay the price. The war had only just begun, but the humans had proven something that day. They were not just survivors, they were conquerors too. The Lurkin had never faced an enemy like this before. Their technology was superior in many ways, but they lacked the one thing that made humanity dangerous: a burning desire to protect what was theirs, to fight for survival. When the first battle ended, the Lurkin fleet was in disarray, and the human ships moved quickly to take advantage of the chaos. They didn't stop to celebrate their victory. Instead, they pressed on, striking at the heart of the Lurkin empire. The human ships adapted as they moved deeper into enemy space, creating new tactics on the fly, learning from every engagement. While the Lurkin scrambled to regroup and regain control, they had underestimated the human ability to learn to evolve in the heat of battle. The second confrontation came less than a week later. The Lurkin had repaired their damaged ships and reinforced their ranks, but they were not prepared for the guerrilla tactics. The humans had perfected a few human ships, made themselves visible on the edge of Lurkin sensor range, and drew the entire fleet into a trap that had been carefully orchestrated over the course of days. The Lurkin pursued the human ships with relentless determination, but as they moved deeper into the trap, they found themselves encircled by a dozen ships they hadn't seen coming. The ambush was swift and brutal, as the Lurkin fleet was torn apart by quick, coordinated strikes and tactical precision. It was a reminder to the Lurkin that humanity was a force of nature, one they could not simply crush with brute strength. The battle left the Lurkin in shock. But it also gave them something else, a deep sense of fear. They had always seen themselves as the apex of civilization, the rulers of the stars, but the humans had shown them that their empire was not invincible, not against an enemy that could think and fight like this. The human fleet moved faster now they had learned the terrain of Lurkin space, and knew where to strike. They hit supply lines deep within enemy territory, disrupting their logistics, and forcing the Lurkin to divert more resources to defensive measures. They attacked colonies in the outer systems, not to conquer, but to destabilize. They knew the Lurkin relied heavily on their colonies to fuel their war machine, and once the colonies were under siege, the entire foundation of the empire would begin to crack. While the Lurkin struggled to reinforce their positions, the human fleet made a bold move to push even deeper into Lurkin space. The flagship of the human fleet, a ship called Revenant, was piloted by Captain Kara Drake, a woman who had led her people through countless battles and had never lost a single one. Her reputation spread throughout the Lurkin ranks like wildfire. Her name became a symbol of defiance, a reminder that humanity was not a race to be ignored. The Lurkin tried to retaliate, but their responses were always too slow, always outmaneuvered by the cunning of human strategy. Soon they realized that no matter how many ships they built, no matter how many soldiers they sent, the humans would always find a way to strike first, always find a way to turn the tide in their favor. The war had reached a tipping point, and for the first time in history, the Lurkin Empire began to feel the weight of its own arrogance. The humans were not just surviving, they were winning. They were taking control of the stars one system at a time, and the Lurkin could do nothing to stop them. The Lurkin were no fools. They had learned from their failures, but the humans were always one step ahead. Their ingenuity and unpredictability had become their greatest strength. Each battle left the Lurkin more frustrated and desperate. Their command structure began to fracture as the high-ranking generals began to argue over how to deal with this new threat, but their infighting only played into humanity's hands. While the Lurkin bickered, the humans pressed on with even more audacity. They launched daring strikes on Lurkin homeworlds, targeting their core cities and major infrastructure. They didn't aim to destroy the planets, but to weaken the Lurkin morale, to show them that no place was safe, no home was beyond reach. The Lurkin had made one grave mistake in underestimating humanity. They had assumed humans were like any other species they had encountered, ones that fought with honor or strategy. But humans fought for survival, they fought for family, for the future. They had something to prove, and they would stop at nothing to prove it. The war spread from one system to another like wildfire. With each new engagement, the human forces grew stronger. Their numbers increased as more and more humans volunteered to join the fight. Entire fleets of ships were constructed in record time. As humanity's manufacturing ability kicked into overdrive, the human race had always been adaptable, but now they were evolving faster than ever before. They learned to use Lurkin technology against them, reverse engineering weapons and ships faster than the Lurkin could come up with countermeasures. The humans were also getting better at psychological warfare. They broadcasted their victories across the stars, using the media to spread stories of their heroism and resolve. Every battle won was a symbol of human resilience, a rallying cry for all those who had suffered under Lurkin oppression. Across the galaxy, new factions began to rise in support of humanity. Colonies that had once feared the might of the Lurkin were now pledging their allegiance to the human cause in the face of an undefeatable enemy. The Lurkin began to lose their grip on the galaxy. Humanity was not only surviving, they were starting to inspire an uprising, and the Lurkin Empire began to feel the sting of rebellion from within their own ranks. It was a quiet revolution, but it was growing steadily as more and more Lurkin soldiers deserted their posts and fled to join the human cause. Humanity's greatest strength was not just their physical prowess or tactical genius. It was their unity in the face of adversity. The human fleets began to rally under one banner, one cause, and it was not one of conquest, but of liberation. They fought not just to defeat the Lurkin, but to free the galaxy from the yoke of oppression. For the first time in millennia, the Lurkin Empire was being torn apart from the inside out as more and more worlds that had once been enslaved by the Lurkin saw humanity's victory and chose to follow suit. The Lurkin could no longer hold their position and began to retreat, their forces scattered across the stars with no central command to guide them. The tide was turning. But there was still one final obstacle before humanity could claim victory. The Lurkin had their ultimate weapon, a massive dreadnought known as Annihilator. It was a ship of unimaginable power capable of wiping entire fleets from existence. With a single blast, the humans knew this would be their greatest challenge yet, and that the end of the war would depend on their ability to overcome it. The Annihilator was a ship of legend, a weapon of terror, that the Lurkin believed would give them the power to crush humanity once and for all. It was a fortress of metal and fury. Its weapons could destroy entire fleets in a single blast, and its shields were impenetrable. The Lurkin believed it was invincible, and for a time humanity knew the only way to end the war was to destroy it. But doing so would be no easy task. The Annihilator was stationed at the heart of the Lurkin Empire, guarded by the most powerful forces. They had left a fleet of dreadnoughts and advanced battle cruisers. Humanity's small but fiercely determined fleet had to face this impossible task with courage and conviction. Captain Kara Drake knew this was the moment that would define everything. It was no longer about just survival. It was about ending the Lurkin reign of terror. Once and for all, she gathered her commanders and began to formulate a plan. They could not face the Annihilator head-on. That would be suicide. Instead, they would have to strike it in a way that the Lurkin would never expect. The humans had learned to fight from the shadows, to strike when their enemies least expected it. And now it was time to use those tactics on the greatest threat they had ever faced. The plan was bold and risky, but it was humanity's only hope. They would infiltrate the Lurkin defenses using small stealth ships to bypass their outer perimeter and get close to the Annihilator without detection. Once they reached the dreadnought, they would disable its weapons and shields from within, and then signal the main fleet to launch a full assault. The plan relied on perfect coordination. Every ship had to play its part, and the smallest mistake could mean certain death. But the humans had something the Lurkin could never understand: a sense of unity that no enemy could break. Captain Drake's fleet moved into position under the cover of darkness, slipping through Lurkin space undetected as the Annihilator loomed ahead like a shadow of death. The human ships navigated the treacherous asteroid fields and debris clouds surrounding the Lurkin stronghold, knowing that one wrong move would trigger an alarm. But they were silent as ghosts, their stealth technology masking their presence from Lurkin sensors. The first phase of the plan was a success. The infiltrator ships reached the Annihilator and began their assault from within. The Lurkin crew had no idea they were under attack. The human ships disabled the dreadnought's weapons and shields from the inside. One by one, small teams of human soldiers infiltrated the ship's control rooms and planted explosives where they would do the most damage. But just as the final charges were set to explode, a Lurkin commander grew suspicious and launched a full alert. Humanity had run out of time. The Lurkin forces began to mobilize, but it was too late. The main human fleet had already arrived. The battle was fierce, but the Lurkin were already at a disadvantage. Their greatest weapon had been neutralized, and their once formidable fleet was scattered as human ships descended upon them like a swarm. The Annihilator was doomed. The explosion tore through the Lurkin flagship like a crack of thunder, its once impenetrable hull shattered under the force of the blast, and with it the heart of the Lurkin Empire began to crumble. Captain Drake watched from her flagship as the Annihilator disintegrated into a cloud of debris. The Lurkin had lost their greatest weapon, and with it their ability to win the war. Humanity had turned the tide forever. The destruction of the Annihilator was a turning point in the war, but it was not the end of the Lurkin threat. In the wake of their greatest loss, the Lurkin forces were shattered, but not defeated. The surviving commanders gathered what was left of their fleets and retreated into deep space. They were not willing to surrender, not yet. Instead, they began to regroup and plan their revenge. But the humans had already anticipated this. They knew the Lurkin would not simply fold, and the moment they saw their flagship destroyed, they began to move quickly to capitalize on their advantage. Earth's leaders met in secret to discuss the next steps. They had already won a monumental victory, but they understood that the war was far from over. Now was the time to press forward to ensure the Lurkin could never rise again. Humanity had shown the galaxy what it was capable of, but they needed to make sure that no other species would ever dare challenge them again. The decision was made to take the fight to the Lurkin homeworlds. to cut off their ability to regroup to ensure there would never be a threat again. The human fleet prepared for the final push. They had suffered losses in the war, and many had paid the ultimate price, but their resolve was unshakable. Captain Kara Drake was more determined than ever. She had led her people through the darkest days of the war, and now she would lead them to its end with a fire in her heart and a steady hand. She stood at the head of the human fleet, ready to bring the Lurkin to their knees. The journey to the Lurkin homeworld was long and perilous, but humanity had learned to adapt to the unknown. Their ships moved swiftly across the stars, their technology evolving by the day. As they crossed into Lurkin-controlled space, they encountered pockets of resistance, but nothing like the strength they had faced before. The Lurkin no longer had the numbers or the leadership to mount a meaningful defense. Humanity's victory had already become inevitable. The first human ships arrived at the Lurkin capital planet, the world where the Lurkin first rose to power. It was a massive fortress world surrounded by layers of defense networks and orbital platforms. But the human fleet had come prepared. They launched a series of coordinated strikes to disable the planet's defenses, while another force moved in to infiltrate the capital itself. The humans were no longer fighting for survival. They were fighting to end an era, to liberate the galaxy from the Lurkin stranglehold, and ensure that no species would ever experience the terror they had inflicted. Humanity's forces descended upon the Lurkin capital with an intensity that shook the heavens. The skies burned as massive explosions rocked the surface of the planet. The Lurkin tried to fight back, but their forces were scattered and disorganized. The capital's defenses crumbled under the relentless assault, and as human boots touched the surface of the Lurkin homeworld, the final battle began. The streets of the capital city were filled with fire and dust. The once proud buildings of the Lurkin Empire now stood in ruins as human soldiers pushed forward, determined to finish what had begun years ago. The Lurkin resistance was scattered, but they fought with the desperation of a species that knew it was dying. Their numbers were few and their strength was broken, but they fought nonetheless. They would not give up without one last fight. Captain Drake led her forces into the heart of the Lurkin capital, the final stronghold, where the last remnants of their leadership had gathered. It was a fierce battle. The humans were outnumbered, but they were not afraid. They had faced greater odds and triumphed time and time again. The humans moved with ruthless precision, every step taking them closer to the heart of the Lurkin Empire, to the moment when it would all come to an end. The heart of the Lurkin capital lay before them, a massive citadel buried deep beneath the planet's surface, where the remnants of the Lurkin High Command had taken refuge. The battle had raged for hours across the broken streets. The Lurkin were desperate, their forces dwindling with every passing minute, but their leadership held firm. They had retreated into their last stronghold to make their final stand, but the humans would not be denied their victory. The assault on the citadel was swift. The human forces pushed forward through the crumbling city streets. The smell of smoke and death hung in the air. The once grand towers of the Lurkin, now reduced to rubble. As the humans moved forward, their faces grim, their eyes steely with determination, Captain Kara Drake led the charge, her voice steady over the comms, as she coordinated the final push to bring an end to the Lurkin reign. Their forces reached the gates of the citadel, and the battle took on a new intensity. The Lurkin High Command had assembled their best soldiers for one last desperate defense. The human soldiers clashed with them in a brutal firefight, but the Lurkin's strength was fading. Their will to fight weakened with each fallen comrade. The human soldiers were relentless. They moved with precision, their tactics honed through years of war. As they advanced on the citadel's inner sanctum, where the last of the Lurkin leadership had gathered, the final confrontation would take place. There would be no surrender, no negotiation. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. As the humans breached the inner chambers of the citadel, Captain Drake's team stormed the final defense lines, meeting the Lurkin leaders face to face in the heart of their empire. The room was silent for a moment. As the two sides stood across from each other, the Lurkin High Command was defiant, but there was fear in their eyes. They knew their time had come, and they had no hope of victory against the human forces that now stood before them. Captain Drake stepped forward, her weapon raised, and her voice clear, as she addressed the Lurkin leaders. You had your chance. You could have turned back when we first warned you, but you chose war. Now it ends here. And now the Lurkin leaders said nothing. Their arrogance had failed them. Now they would be judged for the suffering they had caused across the galaxy. One by one, the remaining commanders of the Lurkin were apprehended, and their empire crumbled to dust. The human forces had won. They had liberated countless worlds and crushed the heart of the Lurkin regime. But as the dust settled, Captain Drake stood in the wreckage of the Lurkin citadel, her face a mask of grim satisfaction. She had led her people through the fires of war, and now it was over. The galaxy was free. The human forces began to secure the capital, as the last of the Lurkin resistance surrendered their weapons, and their fleets were scattered. The war was won, but the cost had been great. Humanity had lost many in this struggle, but in the end they had proven what they were capable of. They had shown that no matter the odds, no matter the enemy, they could rise above and conquer all that stood in their way. The human flag was raised above the Lurkin capital as a symbol of victory, but also of a new beginning. The galaxy was finally free of the Lurkin's oppressive grip, and humanity had earned its place as the dominant force in the stars. With the fall of the Lurkin Empire, the galaxy was silent for the first time in centuries. The sounds of war faded into the distance as the human fleet secured the last of the Lurkin strongholds. Captain Kara Drake stood on the bridge of the Revenant, looking out across the stars. The war was over, but the weight of victory hung heavy in her heart. The cost had been great, and though humanity had emerged victorious, it had come at a price. The Lurkin were defeated, but the scars of the war remained. Humanity had fought not just for their survival, but for the freedom of every species that had suffered under the Lurkin's tyranny. The galaxy was in ruins, and though the Lurkin had been shattered, the task of rebuilding would be monumental. Captain Drake knew this would be the next battle, the one where humanity would need to prove its strength, not in combat, but in compassion. As the human fleet moved back to Earth, the people began to mourn their lost comrades, the families torn apart by the war, the planets that had been devastated by the Lurkin's invasions. But they also began to rebuild. New alliances formed in the wake of the conflict as the humans reached out to their former enemies, offering peace and aid to those who had once been their foes. In the distant corners of the galaxy, colonies that had been under Lurkin control for centuries now looked to the humans as their liberators. They had suffered under the weight of Lurkin rule for far too long, and now they were free, but the path forward would not be easy. The scars of war would not fade overnight, and trust would take time to build. The first human steps on foreign soil were met with hope, but also with fear. The Lurkin had been a dominant force for so long that many were unsure if humanity could live up to their new role as leaders of the galaxy. Captain Drake and her crew were aware of the delicate balance they had to maintain. They could not simply replace one tyrant with another. Instead, they would have to prove to the galaxy that they were worthy of the responsibility that had been thrust upon them. The work of rebuilding began immediately. Humanitarian efforts were launched across the stars to aid the war-torn colonies, to provide food and shelter to those who had lost everything, while the human fleets began to patrol the outer systems, ensuring that no remnants of the Lurkin forces remained. The galaxy was in chaos, but it was a chaos born of hope. Humanity had shown the galaxy that they could overcome even the darkest of times, but now they had to show that they could rise to the challenge of peace. Captain Drake found herself standing in front of a council of leaders from dozens of worlds, all with their own agendas, their own desires, and their own fears. The room was tense, but as she stood there looking into their eyes, she knew something had changed. Humanity had earned their place at this table. They had fought not just for themselves, but for all the species that had been subjugated under Lurkin rule, and now it was time for them to take the next step forward. A new era was beginning, and humanity would not shy away from it. They would lead, but they would lead with empathy and strength. And slowly but surely the galaxy began to heal as alliances were formed, new treaties signed, and old wounds began to mend. The war was over, but the story of humanity's rise had only just begun. The galaxy was changing, but not all were ready for the shift. Many former allies of the Lurkin watched humanity's rise with suspicion. Not every species had been freed from the Lurkin grip with kindness, and some still held grudges from years of oppression. Now humanity had to prove they were not just conquerors, but true leaders, not just fighters, but protectors. In the days after the war, Captain Kara Drake found herself in constant meetings with representatives from dozens of planets, each one bringing their own concerns, their own demands. Some wanted immediate reparations for the destruction caused by the Lurkin occupation. Others questioned humanity's motives, fearing that they might replace one tyrant with another. The weight of these decisions pressed heavily on Kara's shoulders. For every victory, there were still those who did not trust humanity to lead them. They had known only cruelty for so long that peace seemed like a foreign concept to them. Humanity's intentions were true, but their actions would speak louder than words, and they knew the road to healing would be long and fraught with obstacles. But in every challenge, Kara saw something that fueled her hope. The human spirit was alive and fierce, and there was no doubt that they would do whatever it took to prove themselves worthy of this new role. As the voice of the galaxy, Kara worked tirelessly to build coalitions with the very species who had once been enemies. She met with the survivors of the Lurkin's most loyal allies, the ones who had fought to the last breath in defense of their empire. At first, these meetings were tense, filled with distrust and anger. But Kara knew that time and patience would heal old wounds. Slowly, the humans began to establish trust with their new allies. They sent humanitarian aid to planets still reeling from the destruction of the war. They worked with former enemies to rebuild damaged infrastructure and provide resources for those who had suffered. Kara's greatest challenge came when a faction of the former Lurkin military declared themselves the last true heirs of the Lurkin Empire. They were a group of highly skilled warriors who had escaped the fall of the capital, and now they were seeking to rally others to their cause. Their goal was to reclaim the power the Lurkin had lost and reassert their dominance over the galaxy. They posed a threat to the fragile peace humanity had worked so hard to establish. But Kara knew that a battle for dominance would do nothing but plunge the galaxy back into chaos. She couldn't allow the cycle of war to continue, and so she made a decision, one that would take everything humanity had learned about compassion and leadership. She would meet with the leaders of the rebel faction and offer them an alternative to war. She would offer them peace. It was a risky move, and one that could have easily backfired, but Kara had faith in the human ability to change, to evolve in the face of hardship. The meeting took place on a neutral world, a planet far from the reach of any remaining Lurkin stronghold. The rebel leaders were wary, but Kara did not show fear. She spoke of unity and the future of the galaxy, a future where no species ruled over another, a future where every voice could be heard. The conversation was long and heated, but eventually the rebel leaders agreed to cease their campaign and negotiate a new future for their people. The humans had once again proven that they could solve conflict not with violence, but with dialogue and understanding. The galaxy was still healing, but now there was hope. They could thrive under the leadership of those who had fought not for power, but for peace. Humanity had earned its place in the stars, not through the strength of their weapons, but through the strength of their hearts. As the galaxy began to heal, the road to true unity was long and full of hurdles. Not every species was as quick to embrace humanity's leadership. Some held on to old grudges, others feared the new power dynamics, and the Lurkin's former allies still lingered in the shadows, plotting in the dark corners of space. But humanity was resolute. They had weathered the storm of war and emerged stronger. They would face this challenge with the same determination that had led them to victory. Captain Kara Drake continued to lead her people with unwavering focus, but she knew the work was far from done. The human fleet had become a symbol not just of strength, but of stability and peace. Their presence in the galaxy was now seen as a stabilizing force, but peace would not come overnight, and the old tensions that had driven the galaxy to war still simmered beneath the surface. Captain Drake knew this all too well, and so she set out on a new mission, not to fight, but to unite the fractured galaxy one planet at a time. The first step was to continue the work of rebuilding the worlds that had suffered the most during the war. The human fleet dispatched ships loaded with food, water, and medical supplies to those who had been devastated by the Lurkin occupation. They built new infrastructure on planets that had been reduced to rubble and helped to establish new systems of governance that were more just and fair than the ones the Lurkin had left behind. These efforts were met with skepticism by some, but for the first time in millennia, many planets began to see the true value of the humans' leadership. They were not conquerors, they were protectors. They were not there to rule, But to help restore balance, the next challenge came when a coalition of planets who had once been aligned with the Lurkin began to question humanity's growing influence. They feared that their autonomy was being eroded, and that humanity would become the new dominant force in the galaxy, not through military might, but through political influence. They began to form their own alliances and push back against the human presence in their space. Captain Drake knew this was inevitable. It was the price of peace. But it was also an opportunity to prove that humanity could be a true force for good. She called for a summit to bring together all the different factions of the galaxy, the neutral worlds, the former lurking colonies, and the new allies that had pledged their support to humanity's cause. It was a daring move, one that could easily backfire. But Kara trusted her people and the message they had carried throughout the war. We fight for freedom, we fight for peace, and we fight for each other. The summit was tense, but it was also a step forward. The human delegation, led by Captain Drake herself, met with the leaders of the opposing factions in a neutral system at a time when the galaxy was at a crossroads. They could continue to fight and divide themselves even further, or they could choose to negotiate and build something new. Kara spoke of a future where no species was oppressed, where cooperation and mutual respect would replace conflict and division. She did not promise easy answers, but she promised that humanity would be there every step of the way to help rebuild what had been broken. As the negotiations began, many leaders were skeptical, but they were also tired of war, tired of the endless cycle of conquest and destruction. Kara's words resonated with many, and one by one the factions began to come to the table. Even those who had once stood against humanity now saw that their future lay in cooperation rather than conflict. It was not a perfect solution, and there would be many challenges ahead. But for the first time since the war began, there was a true sense of hope in the air. The galaxy had witnessed humanity's strength in battle, but now they were witnessing something more important: humanity's strength in peace. The war was over, the Lurkin were gone, and the galaxy was ready to take its first steps toward a new beginning. The summit was a turning point in the galaxy's future. The leaders who had gathered to discuss the terms of peace and cooperation found themselves at a crossroads. The weight of the war still hung over them, but the promise of a new era was too great to ignore. Captain Kara Drake sat quietly among the council leaders, listening carefully to every word spoken. But her mind was racing. There was still so much work to be done, so many forces that still sought to divide the galaxy, but humanity had proven that it could overcome the most insurmountable odds, and now they had to prove that they could do the same for peace. The negotiations took days and nights, as the representatives from various factions fought over details. Old wounds were reopened and trust was hard to come by. But slowly, bit by bit, the conversations turned from suspicion to understanding. The human delegation, led by Kara, worked tirelessly to find common ground. They did not demand that others bend to their will, but instead offered compromise and solutions that could benefit all parties involved. They knew that unity would not come through force, but through mutual respect for the sovereignty and cultures of the various species. They could no longer afford to be conquerors, they had to be partners in a new order. The breakthrough came when the former lurking colonies agreed to join the discussions. After months of silence, they finally saw the merit of working alongside humanity rather than resisting them. Their people had suffered under lurking rule for so long that they were weary of war, weary of fighting for survival. And now they sought a better future, one where they could chart their own course, under their own terms. Humanity offered them that future where they could rebuild without fear of subjugation. The first major treaty was signed, and with it came the beginning of the galactic rebuilding process. The terms were simple yet profound. It called for the creation of a unified council, a governing body made up of representatives from all species of the galaxy, each one given a voice, each one given a say in the future of the stars. The council would serve as a forum for resolving conflicts and making decisions that would affect the galaxy as a whole. It would not be dominated by any one species, but would function as a true alliance built on cooperation and shared goals. The signing of the treaty was broadcast across the galaxy, a historic moment that marked the beginning of a new era. The war was over, but the work had just begun. The first steps toward rebuilding had been taken, and the galaxy's future seemed brighter than ever. But Kara knew that there were still many challenges ahead. The scars of war would take time to heal, old rivalries and mistrust would not vanish overnight. But for the first time in generations, there was hope. Where there had been none, the human fleet began to shift from its military focus to peacekeeping patrols, moving through the galaxy not with weapons drawn, but with open hands. Humanity's diplomats began to work with former enemies, to establish trade routes and exchange knowledge, to share technology and resources that would help all species thrive. The human presence in the galaxy had gone from one of military dominance to one of unity and hope. The work was slow but steady, and in every system that had once been torn apart by conflict, there was now a sense of purpose. Humanity had not only won the war, but had shown the galaxy that it could lead with grace and wisdom. The human race had become a beacon of peace in a fractured galaxy, and for the first time in centuries, there was a sense of optimism that stretched across the stars. The story of the war was now part of the galaxy's past, but the story of humanity's rise to a new future had only just begun.